1 month to go before the UK votes in a general election that's tipped to send Britain and possibly Europe into unchartered territory. Whoever of the Conservatives and Labour forms the next government, the winner's share of the votes expected to be perhaps the smallest ever for a winning party. In last week's candidates' debate, with 7 party leaders on stage, the mainly bipartisan system of old looked like, well, history. We'll naturally look at who the polls favor, but arguably as important is who will play kingmaker. The end of a straight choice between a mainstream left and a mainstream right. Well, that's a familiar tale in Europe, in countries like Germany, France, perhaps soon Spain. In the case of Britain, the next government could either draw much closer to Europe if the surging Scottish nationalists have their way, or leave the EU altogether if a re-elected David Cameron makes good on his promise of an in or out referendum. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a divided Britain. With us, Jeremy Stubbs. He's chair of the British Conservatives in Paris. Hello. Thanks for being with us. Thanks as well to Evan O'Connell, vice chair of the Labour Party here in Paris. His blog is called What Scotland Thinks. John Curtis teaches at the University of Strathclyde. Welcome back to the show. And France 24's Melissa Bell, who's been covering UK general elections dating back to, can we say it?
No, I'd rather you didn't, actually. It scared me when we had to work it out.
A long while, shall we say. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. We can start with the latest tracking polls, and, well, frankly, they're as clear as mud. According to who you believe, the Tories are up by 2 points, up by 1 point, down by 1 point. The Conservatives on track, though, to garner the greatest number of seats. However, as we said at the outset, what also matters is the share of the vote. And if you look at elections since the World War II in the UK, the two main parties in 1951, you see the beginning of the graph there, they garnered nearly 97% of the vote. This time, it'll be less than 2/3. Melissa, this really is unlike any other election.
A huge shift, and of course, if you that graph is really tells you a great deal about the way British politics has changed. It used to be such a terribly tribal affair, and it was for such a long time. People voted for the Labour Party or for the Conservative Party because they'd always voted that way, because their family had voted that way, because they came from a certain type of education, because they saw the world in a particular kind of way. And that's changed profoundly. I was looking at a figure earlier which is quite startling. Some studies have suggested that by 2025, only 24% of people will feel attached to any particular political party. It was in the 1980s more than 50%. People had a clear view, and it was one of the two main parties, which was why the Liberal Democrats had so much trouble making headway over all those years. That's what's changed. British politics is simply no longer as tribal as it was.
And so, in other words, does that mean it's more volatile, that more seats are up for grabs?
It's much more volatile, and this is likely to be, one thing looks certain, is that it's going to be the tightest race that we've seen in the last few general elections. And it suggests, you showed that very startling image of the UK's candidates debate. I thought it was particularly striking. You suddenly had a number of different people on stage, and it is the face of British politics itself that has changed, with so many variables that no one can quite compute for now. What will happen up until the vote itself in particular constituencies, and what will happen beyond, assuming that there is a hung parliament, assuming that some kind of pact has to be cobbled together in order that some party can rule, even as a minority government. There are so many ifs and buts and questions about the leadership of a number of different parties and the effects of the various permutations and alliances possible, that everything's up to grabs. And it makes this politically, this general election more exciting, I think, than any we've had that I can remember in any case.
Jeremy Stubbs, 1 week ago, David Cameron does the ceremonial thing. He comes out of number 10. He says, I'm going to go see the Queen now and ask to dissolve Parliament. And he said, it's going to be a choice between me or Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party. However, my question to you is, would you say that within the Conservative camp, the main rival, is it the Labour Party, or is it these smaller parties, most notably the more far-right-leaning UKIP?
Well, I think the fact is that whoever is leader, it's going to be David Cameron or Ed Miliband. No one else can be the leader. Where will they find support? That may be the other question here. Both parties are, of course, going all out for victory themselves. And I'm sure no one will commit or it would be foolish to commit to any sort of pact before the elections. However,
among the rank and file
Yeah.
that you speak to, is the number one concern Labour, or is the number one concern these smaller parties?
well, everybody has been worried, it has to be said, about UKIP chipping away at both parties. And they're not just worried by the sort of people I speak to, are not just worried by a possible loss of support, but also to some extent by what UKIP stands for as a more populist nationalist party. And really I think the question is, David Cameron, he's a popular man, he's likely to be the leader, but who will we get on our side? What we're hoping for, of course, is that we'll get UKIP's voters before they vote for UKIP. That is a policy.
Evan O'Connell, it can be argued that the problem for Labour south of the border is a little bit UKIP, a little bit the Greens, and north of the border, a lot the Scottish National Party.
Now, Scotland, of course, is a special case. What I would say, first of all, concerning the Greens in the UK, is that you've seen recently a bit of a fallback in the Green vote. Part of that was due to a disastrous radio interview with Natalie Bennett, the Green Party leader, who really just froze up and couldn't answer basic questions on her party's economic platform. So you're seeing now that there's a perception among many people who are flirting with the Greens that they're perhaps not ready for prime time. In terms of north of the border, what I would say is, look, the polls are putting the SNP very, very high in terms of the vote share, and thus in terms of the number of seats that they could take from Labour and from other parties, I would add, also from the Lib Dems who are forecast to lose some seats. What I would say at the same time,
but there are even some predictions saying Labour could be completely wiped from the map in Scotland.
I don't believe that for a second. What I would say is that polls are a look at a moment in time of public opinion. They firm up as the election approaches, but you will still have people that will flirt with a smaller party or a party that is playing against the system and that will come home in the end when it comes to election time. You saw in 2010 that the Lib Dems at one point were the largest party in the polls. They fell back down to, I believe, 23% of the vote, if I'm not mistaken, which was only a point more than their vote in the previous election.
So you're arguing the point opposite of what Melissa said at the outset, which is you're saying that at the end of the day, people come home to their political families.
I think you'll see some of that. I think what you'll see is that when people go into the polling booth, a lot will think twice and will think, and the Labour argument is indeed that voting for the SNP is not a vote for a Labour government, despite what the SNP is saying. That voting for the SNP weakens Labour's possibility to form an effective government, and that the only way to ensure an effective Labour government in May is voting Labour.
John Curtis, how different a political landscape will it be on the evening of May the 7th?
Well, in some ways it'll be different, in some ways it won't. I think one can easily overplay the extent to which the UK has been a two-party system. I think the truth is the two-party system of the 1950s, at least, was actually broken 40 years ago in the two 1974 elections. Those were the first elections at which the Liberals made a significant advance. They were the first elections at which the SNP first did one in Scotland, and they were the elections which clearly registered that Northern Irish politics had become divorced from that of the rest of the United Kingdom. So we've been having a three-party system, certainly at least across the UK as a whole, and a four-party system in Scotland now for some 40 years. What, of course, is intriguing about this election, however, is that despite the fact that the Democrats may now be facing their worst election results since before 1974, neither Conservative nor Labour seem to be able to particularly profit. And the truth is, they can't particularly profit because, as you kind of suggest, there's more questioning actually, this isn't an election between Conservative and Labour. Who wins this election is not going to be determined by whether or not people prefer Mr Cameron to Mr Miliband or vice versa. It's going to be determined by whether or not across much of England people prefer UKIP to the Conservatives or not, because 2/3 of the vote that the Conservatives have lost since 2010 have been lost to UKIP. And equally, whether Mr Miliband makes it or not will indeed depend on whether or not he can get votes back from the SNP in Scotland. On that latter point, however, I think the truth is that to suggest that this is some sudden protest vote for a small party is a little bit of a misdescription of the situation. A, the SNP are not a small party. They are the largest party in Scotland, and they have been ever since 2011. And secondly, unlike the Liberal Democrat surge of 2010, which indeed did largely disappear, this is not some certain surge. This is rather the third replication of a phenomenon that we've seen in Scotland throughout the course of the last 4 years. I remind you, back in 2011, 45% of people in Scotland voted for the SNP in the Scottish Parliament election. Under a PR system, that just about got them an overall majority. In the referendum last September, 45% of people voted yes. In a referendum, you lose. What we're now looking at is around 45% of people in Scotland once again deciding to vote for the nationalist cause. But because we have a single-member district system now being used for the Westminster election, that's potentially enough for the SNP to win a landslide. So this is not some new phenomenon. In a sense, the difference between this election and some previous manifestations of SNP support is that it's being played under different rules. Rules which, for the most part, until now have favoured the Labour Party in Scotland, but which now are at risk of causing the Labour Party severe change. So one thing Tony Blair used to say about British elections, they were won or lost in the centre ground of British politics. Well, A, this is no longer an election which is simply about British politics. Indeed, we could argue as to whether British politics still exists anymore, so different is Scotland. And B, it's certainly not being won on the centre ground. The battle between the Labour Party and the SNP in Scotland is a battle on the left, and the battle between the Conservatives and UKIP across much of England is a battle on the right.
Let's pick up on that point. Is it fair to say that the votes, the election itself, won't be won in the centre, won't be won in the middle?
The point's really interesting.
But the coalition will be, perhaps.
You see, both on the left and on the right, the frittering of the vote on one side because of a loss towards UKIP, on the other because of the gains of the SNP at Labour's expense. And even as that has happened, and partly as a result of it, it is a fact that suddenly now we are in a situation where none of the three main parties, the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, are doing tremendously well, and none have been as unpopular at the same time and over such a long period of time in the polls. And that's what's changed substantially. So it's very difficult, of course, to call. It's very difficult for any of them to pierce through at this particular point, and the polls reflect that. Too many people, for now, I think, haven't quite made up their minds. A big difference will be, one of the big questions will be how the SNP does, how UKIP does, as you were saying a moment ago, and how towards the end of the campaign, people who haven't quite made up their minds decide to go. But it isn't being fought in the middle. That has changed substantially. Just one more point, picking up on what was made, the one that was just made a moment ago. The strength of the SNP. Of course, they have this particular battle, which is Scottish independence, and this particularity, which is the regional nature of their politics. But they have done something else quite effectively that the main political parties in Britain haven't for some time, both Labour and Conservatives and to a certain extent Liberal Democrats, which is to speak to the young. And they have very cleverly, I think, addressed one of the problems of politics European-wide, which is that traditional parties are having trouble speaking to young voters, are having trouble adapting themselves to a new and changing electorate with different aspirations, one that has lived through financial crisis, one that doesn't think so much in terms of left and right, but in other terms. And I think that the main political parties have suffered from not being able to address those concerns well enough. The SNP is the notable exception in British politics today.
And on that point, the SNP, you're saying, has made those inroads. When you look now at the issues that are important here in Europe, we've seen last week the OECD giving glowing reviews to Britain for the way the recovery is going. Why are so many voters disgruntled with their political class then, if the economy is doing better than here in France, as some British brag?
It is one of the oddities of the polls at the moment. The coalition on the economy has proven effective. I mean, on a number of different counts, George Osborne has done things that here in France our economy ministers can only dream of. In terms of the figures, they've had good news over the course of the last few weeks that should have helped them in the polls, and it simply hasn't. And I think that's because there is this fundamental shift politically going on in Britain that perhaps the main political parties hadn't seen coming. And I think that the coalition has suffered. Of course, no one will have suffered more from it than the Liberal Democrats, whose ratings in the polls have dropped substantially, and even their leader will struggle to hold on to his seat. They will come off worst from this coalition. But even as British politics used to be all about the pendulum swinging fairly regularly, quite far one way and quite far the other. The last time we saw that great swing was back in 1997. It seems to have swung back, but not quite so far, and every time a little bit closer to the centre. So that each time, one of the predictions is that we'll have a Labour minority government. It might have swung back even more quickly than perhaps it had in the past, but not quite far enough to bring anyone back into Parliament properly.
I saw there Jeremy nodding and Evan shaking his head. Who do I start? I'll start with you, Evan, but very briefly because we're almost out of time.
Yes, of course, of course. Well, look, the Tories have claimed for, ever since this election campaign began, which, to be honest, has been ever since the last election finished, that their focus on reducing the deficit, which, by the way, I would argue that they failed to do, their focus on reducing the deficit has been the one and only way to bring Britain out of the economic crisis and to turbo boost it past the other European economies. First of all, the Tories have only reduced the deficit as a percentage of GDP and failed at reducing the deficit in general terms.
But growth is higher than here in France.
Granted, but it's only... Granted, but British workers have never been so unproductive. They're working for less and they're working for longer. The growth has mainly been through low-wage jobs. The reality is young people are hit. Tuition fees have gone up by 3 times. The NHS, the National Health Service, has been hit hard, and Tory cuts more generally have meant that Britain has become a far more unequal society, which I think is perhaps the big issue for the average Briton coming up to this election.
Jeremy, the argument made that you take away the southeast of England and the recovery in Britain doesn't look so rosy.
Well, of course, if you take away large blocks of the country, it'll make a big difference to the overall picture. It's certainly true that today the southeast makes a very big contribution to the rest of the country, and we hope that the new rail system will help to spread that around a bit more. But one could make a very brief sort of Japanese haiku poem, which would go something like, growth up, employment up, spending power up, deficit down. Now that, I think, speaks for itself. But if we want to look at this in the broader context, we've seen that, OK, maybe the SNP are a threat to Labour, maybe UKIP are a threat to the Conservatives, although I think we're all a threat to each other. What's happening on the one side is we're talking about UK devolution, Scotland as a separate country. With UKIP, we're talking about the relationship to this supranational body, which is the European Union. Those are the big questions that are breaking up the traditional two-party system.
And those questions that we're going to pick up on when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.